Colonisation le Vietnam. Episode 11, The Tiger versus the Elephant. Hello again and welcome back to our little history of Indochina. I want to thank you first of all for being here, and if you haven't done so before, please hit that subscribe button. Please leave us a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify or a rating. All those things go a long way to spreading the podcast. So thank you again, and without further ado, let's delve into our episode of today. Last time we saw that as soon as 1946, while the Viet Minh was heading to war with the French, at the same time it transformed northern Vietnam into a police state and went after all his Vietnamese political opponents. The French were very happy to see Viet fighting Viet. They took out the popcorn, relaxed, and watched the Viet Minh ruthlessly massacre Dai Viet and VNQDD members in the north. In the south, the French took a more proactive stance. They managed to convince various armed groups to switch sides and join them against the Viet Minh because, hey, the Viet Minh was going to kill them anyway. But today, we're going to focus more on the war against the French. So let me remind you where we left off 2 episodes ago. 2 episodes ago, we parted ways in Hanoi at the end of 1946. That was when the Battle of Hanoi started, and with it, the so-called Indochina War began. By January 1947, they were fighting all over Vietnam. But the war was at different stages depending on if you were in the north or the south. If you remember, the war had started in the south a year earlier than in the north. So at the end of 1946, start of 1947, the war was already mature in the south. In fact, the security situation was very dire for the French in there. And that should have sent alarm bells for the French, because guess what? The North would follow the same pattern. Nevertheless, in 1947, if someone had told the French that the war would last 8 years and that at the end they would lose Indochina, I think they would have laughed in their face. However, if someone had said the same thing to Ho Chi Minh, he would have found it hard to believe as well, to be honest. Why? Well, the war that was starting was a massive mismatch, a bit like David and Goliath, or if I talk about soccer, France v Senegal at the 2002 World Cup, or USA against anybody else in basketball. We know now that the Vietnamese won, but if you had to bet in 1947, well, you would have bet the house on the French. Check it out by yourselves. On the one hand, there was the French Expeditionary Corps, 100,000 men, including the Foreign Legion, with artillery battalions supported by the Navy and Air Force. The French coach was Admiral d'Argentlieu, and his captain on the field was General Valluy, a seasoned soldier who first saw combat all the way back in the First World War, and who was a graduate of Saint-Cyr. Saint-Cyr being the French equivalent of West Point in the US, or if you are more familiar with the UK system, this is their Sandhurst Academy. The French soldiers were well armed, well equipped. They were battle hardened, and their morale was also very high. Do not forget that these troops had just defeated the Germans in 1945. Last but not least, on the diplomatic front, France was tacitly supported by the US and England. If you see on the other side, the DRV team was isolated and had no resources. The coach Ho Chi Minh was very experienced indeed, but his young captain on the field, Vo Nguyen Giap, had never been tested at the highest level. I mean, he didn't go to military school. Of course, the DRV troops were motivated and high on independence, but they lacked everything. Training, equipment, ammunition, you name it. Diplomatically, the DRV was not recognized by any country. The US, which Ho Chi Minh had courted assiduously in 1944-45, well, the US had already chosen their side. China had other things to worry about, with the communists and the nationalists engaged in a fight to the death. Not even the Soviet Union bothered with the DRV. Stalin was suspicious of this Ho Chi Minh guy, especially since this guy dissolved the Communist Party in 1945. Stalin considered Ho Chi Minh too nationalist, and in any case, what Stalin cared about was Europe, not Asia. In short, the DRV was alone in the world. So as I said, the first few months of 1947 went very well for the French. Admittedly, the Battle of Hanoi was hard and lasted 2 months, from December 1946 to February 1947. But after that, 2 months were enough for French forces to regain control of all the major towns in the northern and central regions of Vietnam. The regular DRV troops were pushed back by the French steamroller and had to retreat in the upper region, the Viet Bac. The French suffered around 1,800 killed and wounded, but the toll was certainly much higher on the Vietnamese side, even though it is not known. And the only thing that stopped the French was the arrival of the monsoon season in April. As a result, the French command, like any self-respecting favorite, was optimistic. They just had to wait for the rainy season to end before picking up where they left off. Their plan was to score very quickly and wrap up the game. General Valui's strategy was to avoid a long war at all costs and to crush the DRV before they had time to reorganize their forces. So what he planned was a large-scale operation combining infantry, aviation, and amphibious troops. The idea was to secure the Red River Delta, then launch a pincer movement against the Viet Bac base. A first enveloping flank would block the Viet Bac's southern border, and the second flank was to take control of the Route Coloniale 4, that's the highway running along the Chinese border, and prevent any escape towards China. That way, the DRV forces will be encircled and crushed. That would allow the French to capture Ho Chi Minh, Vo Nguyen Giap, and the entire DRV government in one fell swoop, and thus put an end to the war. Planification of this operation was finalized. It would be Operation Léa, and it was scheduled for October 1947. So that's the situation in the north. What I said earlier is that the French should have been more careful, though, because of the situation in the south. Or perhaps the reason why they wanted to strike hard and fast in the north was because they didn't want the war in the north to get bogged down as it was in the south. So let us see now why the French were experiencing so many setbacks in the southern region. And there were 3 main factors to explain those setbacks. 1, the terrain. 2, the Viet Minh strategy. And 3, a lack of reinforcements. So starting with the terrain, this was understandable because the French were playing away from home. As we have seen, the monsoon season forced Valui to stop his offensive, and the French general was champing at the bit to get out there when the rain stopped. But even in dry weather, the roads and infrastructure of Vietnam were just not suited to a modern army like the French one. The Viet Minh guerrillas were better adapted to the terrain. You see, earlier I mentioned the Route Coloniale 4, that's the colonial Route 4, and I said it was a highway along the Chinese border. Well, those Route Coloniale of 1947 Vietnam were actually very bad roads. The quote-unquote motorway between Haiphong and Hanoi, for example, was actually full of potholes, and it barely allowed two-way traffic. As for the bridges, apart from the Dumer Bridge near Hanoi, they were all obsolete and very few were sturdy enough to handle the weight of a mechanized infantry, let alone the weight of tanks. This the Vietnamese knew, and they spent and invested a lot of time and effort in destroying and mining roads and bridges. In a never-ending process, roads were sabotaged at night. French engineers were sent in the morning to repair those roads that the Viet Minh would hit again the next night, and so on. What's more, when the French convoys were at a standstill because they couldn't cross a bridge or because the roads were blocked, well, they were sitting ducks for the Viet Minh, who would launch violent ambushes on the French military columns. For example, in 1947, Nguyen Binh surprised an official motorcade on tour. 2 ministers from the Cochin China government, 43 French and 10 Vietnamese people were killed by 800 Viet Minh guerrillas who managed to get out safely after the fighting. But what made those actions possible were the fact that the population was overwhelmingly supporting the Viet Minh in the war. Party propagandist Tran Huy Lieu put it this way, quote, "The soldier is the inhabitant and the inhabitant is the soldier," end quote. The aim of the Viet Minh was to make their French enemy blind, deaf, and crippled. Blind because the enemy had to be unable to distinguish between guerrillas and peasants. Deaf because all telecommunication systems had to be hacked and disrupted. And the French had to be crippled how? Well, by the destruction of roads, bridges, etc. Vo Nguyen Giap also knew that he had to avoid conventional battles at all costs. So, like any bottom-of-the-table team playing a favorite, he set up his team defensively and avoided being caught out in the open. Again, this is keeping with the first phase of the popular war, withdrawal. This strategy was also formally articulated in a pamphlet called The Resistance Will Win, written by Truong Chinh, who was the Secretary General of the party until its dissolution and who was one of the masterminds behind Ho Chi Minh. With this strategy, Giap hoped to be the one who decided where and when battles would be fought, and to always keep the initiative against the French. That kind of strategy was very frustrating for the French, as it would be for a favorite playing against a team that basically refuses to play. But that was exactly what the Viet Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap wanted. The 30,000 or so regular DRV troops remained in the Viet Bac, and it was the regional troops who were responsible for harassing French convoys and outposts and for setting up ambushes. Ho Chi Minh had already mentioned this strategy to an American journalist during his stay in Paris in 1946 in a very famous quote. So, quote, "It will be a war between an elephant and a tiger. If the tiger ever stands still, the elephant will crush him with his mighty tusks. But the tiger doesn't stand still. He lurks in the jungle by day and emerges only at night. He will leap upon the back of the elephant, tearing huge chunks from his hide, and then he will leap back into the dark jungle. And slowly the elephant will bleed to death. That will be the war of Indochina," end quote. Finally, the third reason why the French were struggling was that they just lacked troops. Picture this. Before World War II, a few thousand troops were all that France needed to keep 20 million Vietnamese in submission. Fast forward in 1947. The situation was so dire that 100,000 soldiers were unable to hold the territory for France. General Leclerc, before he left, had estimated that at least 500,000 soldiers were needed. And that type of number was just logistically and politically impossible to bring to Indochina. So the French were faced with a dilemma: how to go and hunt down the Viet Minh and at the same time keep their positions. What they opted for was the creation of hundreds of military outposts in the country. These outposts were both military bases and administrative centers, and they were commanded by either a non-commissioned officer or by junior officers held by Vietnamese auxiliaries. In the south, by 1947, there were more than 500 outposts, but even that was not enough. These outposts were just too far apart to ensure effective surveillance of the ground, and thus they were very vulnerable to attacks. They were just like islands lost in the Viet Minh Ocean. As a result, these French outposts were very often attacked at night, and sometimes by the very Vietnamese auxiliaries who were supposed to be protecting them. Many books in Indochina talk about the outpost war, and another sentence that you see often written about Indochina war is that the day belonged to the French and the night to the Viet Minh. So what happened was that the French controlled the cities, the towns, and the roads. The Viet Minh reigned over the countryside. It is estimated that by 1947, the Viet Minh controlled almost half of all Vietnamese territory. However, neither the French nor the Viet Minh had the capacity to control all the territory. As a result, the map of the country was a patchwork of Viet Minh and French zones. That's what historians called a leopard skin map. And there were all types of territories: the ones that the French would never occupy, the one that the Viet Minh would never occupy. There were territories that were French during the day but taken over by the Viet Minh at night. There were others that were conquered and then abandoned by one of the parties, then occupied by the other. It was a very different situation depending on where you were in Vietnam. To sum it up, the People's War strategy adopted by the DRV made things very hard for a conventional army like the French one in a terrain like Vietnam. The conclusion that General Valmy drew was that he had to strike hard and fast and make the war as short as possible. As soon as the rain ended, his planned operation would cut off the Viet Minh's head. What's striking to me when I read about this was the commander's certainty that everything would go according to plan. That Ho Chi Minh would be captured, that once Ho Chi Minh was captured, the resistance would collapse from north to south. Presumptuous, isn't it? In any case, the plan was approved by the High Commissioner, and the French were very optimistic in mid-1947. They felt that they had the upper hand, and as a consequence, they adopted a very firm stance: no concessions and no diplomatic overture. Let the weapons do the talking. Politically, though, there was a changing of the guard in 1947. Dargentlieu was replaced as a High Commissioner by a guy called Émile Bollard. The reason why Dargentlieu was tossed out was that he had become a liability for Paris. The French government was trying very hard to attract American aid to their war effort, and Dargentlieu was just too conservative, too staunchly French. So Dargentlieu was demoted. And just like that, the most brilliant mind of the 12th century, as one of his collaborators put it, was out of the way. What was this new guy's mission, though? He was asked to talk to the authentic representatives of the Vietnamese people. What did that mean? Nobody knows. And maybe the ambiguity of the formula is a sign. One of Bollard's first actions was to send an emissary to Ho Chi Minh. And the guy he chose was Paul Mus, one of the best French scholars and one of the few Frenchmen who was campaigning back then for real negotiation with Ho Chi Minh. Paul Mus became an advisor to Émile Bollard, and advised him to reach a settlement with the Viet Minh. And it was in this capacity that Bullard asked him to make contact with Ho Chi Minh. Paul Mus made contact all right, but what is very odd is the mandate he was given. Judge for yourself. Mus was told to let Ho Chi Minh know that France was ready for a ceasefire under one condition, that the Viet Minh lay down first its arms and accept the free movement of French troops throughout the country. Ho Chi Minh replied, quote, "If I accepted these conditions, I would be a coward." End quote. The DRV therefore rejected the French non-offer, even though his own political situation was critical in mid-1947. The DRV was alone against a formidable enemy. Ho Chi Minh had failed in all his attempts to approach the Americans. On the contrary, the US considered France to be a key ally in the emerging Cold War. Ho Chi Minh understood that as long as he did not have international support, his government would have no full authority and would be threatened by his non-communist rivals, for example. Bullard was also aware of that weakness, and what he did when he sent emissaries to Ho Chi Minh was to send people as well to talk to the former Emperor Bao Dai. In conclusion, in 1947, things were looking up, it seemed, for France. The Viet Minh was militarily on the ropes, and Opération Léa, scheduled for October, would finish them off. But what if? What if the Viet Minh held out? As we will see next episode, Opération Léa will not live up to French expectations. After that, the question for all people involved would therefore be, what next? What if the Viet Minh took the game to extra time? Could they make it to penalties? In any case, for all people involved, the reality of a protracted war would become, well, the reality, and force the French to redefine their war objectives. On their side, the Viet Minh would do everything to keep its monopoly on Vietnamese nationalism, and the non-communist Vietnamese nationalists would try to find a space between the Viet Minh and France. See you next week to untangle this increasingly tangled web. Until then, take care and goodbye.